Something strange happens before people change. The things that once distracted you slowly lose their power, and what once felt exciting starts feeling empty. Maybe nothing is wrong with you. Maybe something inside you is outgrowing the noise. There's a specific kind of quiet that descends without warning. You're scrolling through something you loved, a feed that used to pull hours from your day without effort, a hobby that once felt like oxygen, a relationship that demanded constant mental energy, and suddenly there's nothing there anymore. Not anger, not frustration, just absence. The terrible part isn't the absence itself, it's what your mind does with it. I'm losing passion. I'm becoming lazy. Something's wrong with me. You start searching for the problem in the usual places. You increase the stimulus. You try harder. You convince yourself that if you just find the right angle, the right distraction, the spark will return. But it doesn't. And now you're not just experiencing the absence, you're experiencing the anxiety of the absence. Most people interpret this moment as breakdown. What if it's actually the opposite? What if the noise simply stopped working because something inside you already moved forward? What if the things that no longer captivate you aren't broken? They're just incompatible with who you're becoming. There's a strange phenomenon that happens when consciousness shifts. It's invisible at first. You won't see it in a mirror. You won't feel it as a dramatic moment. Instead, you'll notice it as a series of small disconnections. The podcast that used to make 3-hour drives disappear now feels performative. The group chat that required constant attention starts feeling like you're watching yourself perform, rather than being yourself. The ambition that once felt alive now feels like following a script written by someone who doesn't know you anymore. And here's what makes this moment so psychologically disorienting. You blame yourself for the incompatibility. You don't think, this no longer aligns with my evolution. You think, I'm broken. I'm losing it. I'm not trying hard enough. The mind has been trained to interpret loss of interest as personal failure, as if enthusiasm is a character strength you're supposed to maintain indefinitely, regardless of whether it still serves you. But what's really happening is far stranger and far more necessary. There's a layer beneath the losing interest that people almost never examine. It's not that you stopped caring about the things, it's that you stopped having energy for the narrative around those things. And that's completely different. Think about what distraction actually requires. Not just attention. Energy. Constant nervous system activation. A sustained belief that this thing matters in this exact way. Engagement requires you to maintain a story about why you're doing it. And that story has to feel true in the moment, or the whole thing collapses. When you're scrolling endlessly, your nervous system is engaged in a specific loop. Anticipation, brief satisfaction, dopamine reset, reach for more. Your mind is literally trained to stay in this cycle by making each moment feel almost rewarding. It's not really about the content, it's about the mechanism. What people don't realize is that consciousness doesn't stay static. As you become more aware of how you're spending your attention, something shifts in your ability to unsee the mechanism. Once you notice that you're performing interest rather than feeling it, you can't fully unnotice. The illusion breaks. And now, every time you try to re-engage with the same stimulus, you're painfully aware of the gap between what you're doing and what you actually feel. This is why just forcing yourself to care never works. You can't unknow your own inauthenticity. And here's the part that creates the most confusion. Your mind interprets this awareness as loss of capacity, when it's actually an increase in honesty. You're not losing the ability to feel enthusiasm. You're gaining the ability to notice when enthusiasm is real versus manufactured. The exhaustion isn't from trying too hard anymore. It's from the cognitive dissonance of continuing to perform engagement when something inside you has already moved on. This is what nobody tells you about growth. It doesn't come as inspiration. It comes as quiet incompatibility. And until you reframe that incompatibility as evolution rather than failure, you'll keep trying to resurrect a version of yourself that no longer exists. There's something deeply unsettling about realizing that the person you were isn't the person you're becoming. And the person you were, they're watching it happen. Maybe the person you were loved constant validation, loved being needed, loved the certainty of knowing exactly what the next right move was, loved having a clear identity. I'm the person who... fill in the blank. I'm the person who always has energy for everyone. I'm the person who's obsessed with this hobby. I'm the person who's always pushing forward. I'm the person who has it together. These identities aren't lies. They're just limited versions of a larger truth that's trying to emerge. And when something larger starts to emerge, the smaller version panics. Not consciously. You don't wake up thinking, "Oh no, my old identity is being threatened." Instead, it manifests as inexplicable guilt. Why do I feel guilty for not being excited about this anymore? Why does it feel selfish to not want to be the person everyone relies on? Why does stepping back from constant productivity feel like betrayal? Because your old identity is literally being displaced. And displacement to the nervous system feels like death. This is the part of transformation that's actually painful. Not because growth is painful, but because identity dissolution is painful. You're not just changing your mind about something, you're changing your mind about who you are. And the identity you're leaving behind, even if it was constructed, even if it was exhausting, was familiar. It knew how to function. It had a script. The person you're becoming, they don't have a script yet. There's a strange phenomenon that happens when someone starts outgrowing their identity. They'll feel compelled to prove they're still the same person, to prove that the loss of interest doesn't mean they've fundamentally changed, to grab back onto the old things and try to force the spark. Because somewhere deep down, there's a terror. If I'm not this anymore, who am I? And until you can sit with that question without panic, you'll keep trying to resurrect versions of yourself that are already gone. The most disorienting part isn't the loss. It's the liminal space. You're no longer the person you were, but you're not yet fully the person you're becoming. You're suspended between identities, and your mind, which likes certainty, interprets this suspension as wrongness. But what if suspension is actually the necessary condition for transformation? What if the quiet separation from the old things isn't breakdown? What if it's the space where integration happens? The space where you stop performing and start being? Here's something most people miss entirely about this phase. The things you're losing interest in were never actually serving your growth. They were serving your fear. Think about what activities, relationships, and pursuits actually required your constant engagement. The ones that felt urgent. The ones that pulled your attention away from something else. The ones that gave you a clear answer to, what should I be doing right now? What if all of that wasn't actually nourishing you? What if it was strategic avoidance? There's a psychological mechanism most people never examine. When we're avoiding an internal process, a feeling, a realization, a difficult truth about ourselves, we externalize the urgency. We find external things that require just enough of our energy to keep us from going inward. Social media needs constant attention. Certain relationships require constant emotional labor. Certain projects require constant pushing. And as long as we're engaged outward, we don't have to confront what's happening inward. The genius of this mechanism is that it doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like life. It feels normal. It feels necessary. But then something shifts. Maybe your nervous system reaches saturation. Maybe your soul gets tired of performing. Maybe you simply accumulate enough self-awareness that the mechanism becomes transparent. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And now, when you look at the things that used to consume you, you see them differently. Not as sources of genuine interest, but as sources of strategic distraction. And engaging with them again would mean re-entering the avoidance. It would mean ignoring what's now visible to you. This is why willpower doesn't work here. You can't force yourself to be interested in something once you've recognized it as a distraction mechanism. Your psyche won't allow it, because allowing it would mean re-traumatizing yourself with inauthenticity. The strange thing is, this recognition feels like loss, like you've lost your capacity for engagement. But you haven't. You've just redirected your awareness inward. And that's terrifying, because inward is where the real work lives. Inward is where you have to face who you actually are beneath the performance. Inward is where you have to confront the fears that the distraction was protecting you from. Inward is where growth actually requires something from you. Most people interpret this as, I'm losing interest. What's actually happening is, I'm becoming too aware to continue the distraction. And that awareness, while uncomfortable, is the beginning of genuine transformation. Your body has been trying to tell you something. That restlessness you feel, that subtle dissatisfaction, that sense that something's off but you can't name it. Your nervous system has been detecting incompatibility long before your conscious mind decided to investigate. Here's how this works psychologically. Your body registers whether an activity is genuinely nourishing versus strategically distracting. It's constantly measuring, am I in alignment right now? Does this feel true to who I'm becoming? Is this feeding me or just occupying me? And when the answer is, this is just occupying me, your nervous system starts to withdraw, not rebelliously, protectively. It's literally preventing you from further investment in something that doesn't serve your evolution. This is incredibly subtle, but it's happening constantly. A slight tension when you sit down to engage, a low-level fatigue that wasn't there before, a sense of going through motions. These aren't signs of depression or laziness. They're somatic signals that your system is no longer willing to pretend. The problem is that you've been taught to override these signals. Push through the resistance, force the discipline, create the motivation. Your mind has been trained to not trust the body's withdrawal, to interpret it as weakness rather than wisdom. But what if your nervous system is actually more intelligent than your willpower? What if it's been protecting you from prolonging something that's already dead? What if the fatigue is not a character flaw, but a boundary, a refusal to continue investing in what no longer aligns? People often describe this phase as feeling numb or empty. And the interpretation is always tragic. I've lost my passion. I'm burnt out. Something's dying. But what if emptiness isn't loss? What if it's clearance? What if your nervous system is literally clearing the space for something new to arrive? And that clearing process feels like nothing, because you're so accustomed to the constant stimulation that actual quiet registers as absence? There's a radical shift that happens when you stop fighting your own nervous system and start listening to it. When you recognize that withdrawal isn't betrayal, it's redirection. It's your deepest self saying, this path doesn't go where you need to go. Let it go. The most counterintuitive part of this process is what happens when you finally surrender to the incompatibility. You stop trying to resurrect the spark. You stop feeling guilty for not caring. You stop performing enthusiasm you don't actually feel. And suddenly, The noise has less power, not because you've become more disciplined, but because you've stopped fighting your own evolution. There's a strange peace that arrives when you give yourself permission to outgrow something. When you say, "This was real for me once, and now it's not." And that's okay. The anxiety doesn't go away instantly, but the internal conflict dissolves. And internal conflict is what creates the exhaustion. When you stop trying to maintain a relationship with something you've outgrown, you stop expending energy on cognitive dissonance. You're no longer doing two things at once, engaging while resisting engagement. You're just not doing it. And the energy that was trapped in that contradiction suddenly becomes available. This is when something interesting happens. You start noticing what you're actually drawn to, not what you think you should be drawn to, not what your old identity says you should care about, but what genuinely pulls your attention. What makes time disappear, not because you're distracted, but because you're absorbed. What feels true when you're not performing. And these things might look completely different from what you expected. You might notice yourself drawn to quiet, to introspection, to conversations that actually matter instead of conversations that just fill space, to pursuits that don't require constant external validation, to ways of being that feel aligned instead of aspirational. This is the phase where many people panic because they think they're losing themselves. But what's actually happening is the opposite. You're finding yourself, the person beneath the performance, the consciousness beneath the identity, the truth beneath the story. And that person, the one who's emerging, they have different needs, different values, different ways of moving through the world. They're less interested in constant stimulation because they're more interested in meaning, less interested in breadth of engagement because they're more interested in depth. This isn't loss. This is arrival. The difficult part is that arrival doesn't look like what you expected. It's quieter. It's slower. It requires more self-trust and less external validation. And that's why so many people reject it. Because it doesn't feel like growth. Growth is supposed to be exciting, right? Supposed to be visible, but the deepest growth is always invisible at first. It happens beneath the surface. It happens in the nervous system before it happens in behavior. It happens in alignment before it happens in achievement. Maybe the most important thing to understand is this. You're not losing interest in life. You're changing what life means. For a long time, life might have meant productivity, stimulation, achievement, external validation, constant engagement, knowing exactly where you stand, having a clear identity, being relied upon, being seen, being recognized as valuable because of what you do. But something inside you has started to question whether that definition actually works, whether it actually feeds you, whether it aligns with what's true about you now. And when that question begins, there's no going back to the old definition. You can't unknow your own doubt. So what's actually happening isn't decline, it's reorientation. Your entire system is recalibrating toward a different way of being, one that's less about external noise and more about internal coherence. Less about performing and more about being. Less about constantly pushing and more about actually arriving. This reorientation explains everything that feels like loss right now. The scrolling doesn't work the same because your nervous system doesn't need the distraction anymore. The relationship dynamics feel strange because you're no longer willing to perform the role they've cast you in. The ambitions feel hollow because they were built on a version of you that's no longer running the show. The social obligations feel draining because you're finally becoming aware of how much of your life is other people's expectations rather than your own truth. And as you become aware of this, you can't just ignore it and go back. Because awareness doesn't work backward, it only moves forward. This is why the quietness arrives, not as depression, but as discrimination. Your nervous system is literally becoming more selective about where your energy goes, more protective of your attention, more insistent that your time reflects your actual values, not inherited ones. There's a specific kind of strength in this reorientation. It's not the strength of pushing, it's the strength of knowing. Knowing what's real and what's performance. Knowing what feeds you and what drains you. Knowing who you are beneath the roles you've been playing. And that knowing, even though it feels like loss right now, is actually the foundation for everything that's coming. Because once you stop wasting energy on things that no longer serve you, that energy becomes available for things that actually do. Once you stop performing versions of yourself that have expired, your actual self can emerge. Once you give yourself permission to outgrow what you've outgrown, you create the space for what you're becoming to take form. The silence isn't emptiness. It's potential. It's your consciousness clearing the static so it can hear what's actually calling to you.